Hello and welcome. It may be the last form of acceptable discrimination, stigmatizing those who are overweight or obese. Now, over the last decade, bias against those who are overweight has increased a startling 66% in the US, according to a recent study. And that's more than racial or gender discrimination. For children dealing with weight issues, the situation is serious and can lead to suicide thoughts and binge eating. Often it's the adults that children should be able to rely on for their guidance, their parents, their teachers and doctors who are doing the stigmatizing. Now on today's show, coming to you from the campus on Yale University, we talk about what can be done to end the stigmatization of obesity. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me here from New Haven in Connecticut is Dr. Rebecca Poole, Director of Research and Anti-Stigma Initiatives at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity here at Yale University. She is responsible for identifying and coordinating research and policy efforts aimed at reducing weight bias. I want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you very much.
Right. I have to ask you, we talk about perception here when we're talking about people's belief on, of being stigmatized. So how can you measure the stigma of obesity when it's based around an individual's perception of how they're being treated?
Well, there are different ways of assessing weight bias. Certainly self-perception is one way where we ask people about their experiences of discrimination. And that's a way that has been used to study multiple forms of discrimination, whether we're talking about race or gender or age. That's one way. Another way is actually to look at longitudinal research, which watches people over time. For example, in employment settings, we have looked at research that looks at people's wages and how that relates to obesity. And they follow people over 15 years and find that, in fact, over time, there's a wage penalty with obesity. And what's interesting about that is they're able to control for a number of socio-demographic variables that might otherwise account for the findings. That helps establish the legitimacy of the problem.
So is it fair what I said at the beginning, that it's really remained the last acceptable discrimination, that there's laws protecting people against gender bias and race bias and discrimination, and nothing for obesity?
That's true. Right now it is a very socially acceptable form of bias. It's rarely challenged and it's often ignored. And in the United States, if a person is targeted with discrimination because of their gender or race, there are legal sanctions in place to protect them. But when it comes to weight, that's not the case. Currently, only one state in America has legislation to protect individuals based on weight, and that's Michigan.
Now, I know that we're talking specifically about the US here in your studies. Just something to consider, because our viewers are across the world. How does the situation in the US, from any knowledge you have, differ from other societies, other cultures, other countries?
Well, most of the research so far has been published in North America, but there are increasing studies coming out of countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Britain, and their studies are showing the same thing, that bias exists there as well. There's very limited cross-cultural research that has compared attitudes towards obese individuals across different countries, but of the work that exists, what we find is that in countries where there is a cultural preference for thinness and where there are individualistic values that tend to place personal responsibility on individuals for their weight, that's where we tend to see weight bias emerging. So countries like Australia and the United States, whereas countries like Venezuela and India tend to have lower levels of bias. I do think we're going to see more research coming from other countries. I'm frequently contacted by researchers across the world in Asia, Portugal, South Africa, who are very eager to study this issue, and I think we'll be seeing more of it.
Have you come across any cultures, any societies where weight is considered a positive thing? I mean, there was a time, maybe centuries ago, that someone who was heavy was considered lucky because they had the food source. They were considered more fit and healthy because they had the weight.
Well, there are certainly some cultural groups where there is a larger acceptance of diverse body types, and certainly research among African Americans has demonstrated that. So we do see that in some cultures, although we're starting to see weight bias even emerging among those groups as well.
We had an email that came in from Texas, and I want to put this one to you. Renee in Texas says, I was a chunky kid and didn't get healthy until my mid-30s. I never realized how badly I was discriminated against until I lost 40 pounds. The difference in people's reaction to me is night and day. It's a painful realization, even without the pounds. Now, the interesting thing is here, the person themselves didn't really register that discrimination until they actually changed their own situation. I wonder how much harder is it to fight that stigma of obesity when it's sometimes the people themselves involved aren't realizing what's going on until their own situation changes.
I've heard that comment quite a few times, and I think what's very ironic about weight stigma is that it's a very visible form of stigma, and yet people report feeling invisible when they're overweight and obese. Oftentimes they're treated very poorly in public service establishments, they're ignored, they're treated with less respect and courtesy, and that becomes the norm until they've lost weight and they can be on the other side and see, wait a second, I've been treated badly before.
I was horrified to read in the research that you've done a lot of it, the kind of reaction that people who are supposed to be close, family, friends, these people can be so much a part of the problem. And one of the shocking things for me was the study saying that parents often will not put an obese girl, you won't put as much effort into educating an obese girl, won't pay as much for college. I mean, that startled me.
It surprised us too. In the past couple of years, our research has been showing that parents and family members are common sources of weight bias. And I think family members face a difficult challenge. I think, for example, parents who have an overweight child are likely very concerned about their child's weight and want them to lose weight. But those concerns can be expressed in very negative ways that reinforce weight bias, and maybe in the form of critical judgments or negative comments that unfortunately really reduce the quality of life and can really be hurtful to children with a lasting impact over time.
In some cultures, kids are spoiled. And it's happened, I mean, there were reports done on the little emperors, as they called them in China, especially male children were being spoiled by parents, perhaps an only child because of China's laws on children at the time. And I wonder if, there is this difficult cycle for parents where on one hand they want to spoil their kids, give them what they want, and yet on the other hand they're trying to make sure that they don't suffer from the obesity.
I think parents face a difficult challenge, particularly in North America, to help their family eat healthy. We live in a culture where unhealthy food is everywhere. It's available, it's affordable, it's engineered to taste very good. And when we think about children in particular, we know that unhealthy foods are heavily marketed and advertised to children. And I think parents face an uphill battle in trying to feed their children healthy in the face of all of this difficulty.
Now, just give us an idea on the research. The idea that children have suicidal thoughts, that it affects them so much psychologically as well, obviously physically. What really do you think was the main finding coming out of that?
Well, we looked at research of over 40 years of science that looked at weight bias towards children, and there really are a range of negative consequences of weight bias for children and adults. And this does include things like lower self-esteem, risk for depression, poor body image, suicidal behaviors. But it's important to also recognize that there are physical health consequences of weight bias too, that children who are victimized or teased because of their weight tend to cope in ways such as eating more food, engaging in unhealthy eating behaviors like binge eating, or avoiding physical activity, for example, in physical education classes, because that's where they're often teased. And those consequences may actually ultimately reinforce additional weight gain and obesity. So it turns into a vicious cycle.
Downward spiral, it sounds like, yeah. An email that came in from California gives a very different perspective, according to the background of this person. I should just tell you, Morgan from San Diego says he was teased for being overweight as a result of getting, as a result got into shape. So Morgan in California says in his email, there should be a stigma attached to obesity. Hopefully it will motivate people to get healthy. Obese people can always blame others, but it is them who are making their own big bed. What's your view on that approach?
Well, I've heard that comment a number of times before, and in fact what our research shows is that stigma has the opposite effect, that in fact it leads people to cope with stigma by eating more food and refusing to diet. I also think that we need to look at the perception of control when it comes to obesity, and there seems to be an assumption that obesity isn't a choice and it's something that's within personal willpower, but that really oversimplifies the notion that significant weight loss can be sustained over time and actually doesn't reflect the current state of science. We know from a large abundance of research studies that there are very poor long-term results in the ability to sustain significant weight loss even with intensive and expensive treatment options. And what the science shows us is that an individual can lose about 10% of their body weight and maintain that over time, but that losing more weight than that is actually quite difficult. And so we need to really challenge what our perceptions are about the causes of obesity and how that plays into our attitudes.
Well, I have some questions for you coming up. Don't go away. After the break, we look at the role of media in creating the stigma of obesity. But first, we asked people who they thought was to blame for it. Here's what they had to say.
People eat too much. Portions in America seem to be much larger than in other parts of the world.
I think obesity in America is attributed to more than one factor. I think initially it's environmental. It's a product of family habits, eating habits. It's a factor of our fast food environment.
Part of it's choice, just because people do choose sometimes not to be as active as they want to be. But part of it, I say, is environment in the sense that some things like mass production of food, when things are processed and they're using big companies and they don't want to use garden, vegetables, etc., to some degree, people don't have as much choice when you go to the regular grocery store.